Erstklassisch mit Mischke, der musikalische Podcast des Hamburger Abendblatts.
Schönen guten Tag zu einer neuen Folge. Ich habe diesmal einen Gast leibhaftig vor mir. Er ist jemand aus einem Genre, das ich bislang noch nicht hatte. Wir sind uns hier in dem Hotel begegnet. Er hat heute ein Konzert in der Leishalle. Es ist ein Pianist, aber kein normaler Pianist und auch kein rein klassischer Pianist, sondern jemand, der sich fröhlich zwischen den Stühlen bewegt. Der amerikanische Pianist, ich weiß nicht, ob ich Jazz-Pianist sagen sollte. Auf jeden Fall ist es Uri Caine. Und wir machen das Ganze auf Englisch und das wird aber, glaube ich, kein Problem sein. Und ich bin sehr froh, dass das geklappt hat. So, hello and welcome, Uri Caine. Thanks for having me, and I'm glad that this worked out.
Thank you.
So, just to explain something about you for all the people who might not know you as good as I learned about you, you're sort of the first non-straight classical musicians I'm having here, and you're born in Philadelphia. Your first contact I had with your music was decades ago. All these winter and winter recordings, you've done recordings of music of Mahler, Schubert, Schumann, Wagner, Gershwin, Beethoven, Bach. I don't know whether I've forgotten anyone, but you're sort of in between, which I find interesting. Like, you're not a straight jazz musician, if there has ever been something like a straight jazz musician, and you're not a classical musician as well. You're sort of between the chairs. We always start here. You can be asked something easy or something complicated. Which would you prefer?
As you want.
As I want. Okay. Maybe that's an easy question. What's more fun, playing with sheet music in front of you or without?
I think it depends. I mean, if when we're playing without sheet music, especially as improvising musicians, it's totally open. So we're really relying on sort of interacting with each other by what we're hearing rather than what we're seeing. But for a lot of the type of projects where there's arrangements or compositions, there are even sort of these guideposts through a longer improvisation. Sheet music is okay. I think it's probably better to try to internalize the music by memorizing it. But if it's not happening, I have no problem. I don't feel inhibited by having sheet music in front of me. And in some of the classical projects that I've done, I mean, when I'm playing, for instance, the Diabelli variations, I just put up the piano version, and as I'm sort of reading through it and I'm hearing what the orchestra is playing, then I get ideas for improvisations from that, or not. So it's something that you have up there as information if you need it. But in another way, it's not necessary if you sort of have internalized what's going on and feel that you can navigate the music without the sheet music. I think it's probably more it's more relaxed in the sense that you sort of can try different things and you're not so bound by what's written.
I ask because I guess that one of the biggest fears of straightforward classical musicians might be, in a way, to not have music in front of yourself, just being on your own and have no guidelines. And this is something that's completely usual for you, and something that's completely panic rewarding for them.
I mean, I think it's definitely something that you have to get used to, and that I've been in that situation where many classical musicians think, without the music, what can we do? What are we supposed to do? And even if you say something very general, just listen, wait till maybe something happens that you want to improvise. They're more inhibited because they're not coming from that culture. I think that a lot of jazz musicians, I don't necessarily use the word jazz, but people that are improvising find to be very natural and very sort of normal. If that's not what your musical culture is, then it becomes something that you can, it's sort of frightening in the beginning, but like anything, you can practice it and get better at it. And then I think that it's, I've seen it done many ways. I've seen classical musicians that still insist on reading when they play because they don't want to make a mistake. Other people that don't like that at all. They want to play totally from their memory.
But did a piano player come up to you sometime talking about one of those cadenzas in classical concerts where there's a big black hole for them, sort of? They just have to do whatever is necessary to get to the end of the cadenza and they're completely free to do whatever they want. And that's something very frightening for them, maybe. And do you enjoy situations like this?
I'll tell you, I was invited a couple years ago by somebody who said, you should play Mozart piano concertos, and then when you give the cadenza, it'll be an amazing thing. And what I found for myself is, because I don't really consider myself to be a classical pianist. I grew up playing classical music, but I would say from the time I was about maybe 12 or 13, when I sort of wanted to become a jazz musician, or I wanted to play with the older musicians in Philadelphia. That was my focus. So in practicing the Mozart, as time went on, I found that it was getting harder and harder and harder to play the Mozart, because it's just one of those things that looks like it's simple music, but then when you really start to get into it, I was terrified. And I didn't spend any time doing the cadenza. I just sort of showed up to the concert. I was very nervous, which is not usually the way I feel when I'm playing. I got through it. You know, I made a couple little mistakes, but I mean, I managed. It was respectable. And then when it came to the cadenza, it was like, okay, boom, let's go. And I did it. And they actually applauded in the middle of the Mozart concerto after I was done the cadenza. And then when I came off the stage, the guy was like, that was amazing. That never happens. And I said, I know, but I'll never do this again. Because I just felt it's one thing to do that. You know, it's a paradox. The thing that they thought would be the easiest for me, I found it to be increasingly more difficult. And the thing that seemed very sort of, okay, now's the time to play freely, that I guess maybe in a way because of practicing that, you know, it sounds natural. In that culture, it's like, whoa, that's amazing that you did that. And so my question was always, why aren't more people playing their own cadenzas? I mean, there are classical pianists that play their own cadenza. And there were, I know there's several American pianists who either, you know, they play a more contemporary version, like somebody like Frederick Jusky, I don't know if you know who he was, where he wrote these cadenzas where, you know, he's playing classical music and then it sounds much more like modern music. Or even supposed Mozart specialists, like, I forget the guy's name, Robert something, where he supposedly improvises like Mozart during his cadenzas. He's an American pianist that teaches at Harvard, which is not Mozart. So it really depends what your focus is and what your expectation is.
Mentioning focus, if I found everything right in your biography, I found it fascinating because you grew up as playing classical piano. Then you started becoming a pupil of George Crumb. You played in clubs. And then somehow an uncle gave you albums from Miles Davis and John Coltrane. And this turned you to the dark side of the music, sort of.
But, I mean...
was it this sort of growing...
All those things are true, but the chronology is
completely
different.
Messed up?
No, not messed up. But in other words, I mean, I started taking piano lessons when I was 7 because my brothers and sisters played. My mother played piano a little bit. You know, we just had music in our house. My uncle, who was a big jazz fan, gave me a Miles Davis and a John Coltrane record when I was about 11 or 12 because... what was happening was that, you know, I would be playing Mozart and then my mother would say from the kitchen, that's not Mozart, and she would hear me playing. I was like, I know, Mom, I'm just trying to work it out, just try to play something. And she's like, no. And so he saw that I was interested. And when I started to hear that music, I started to wonder, how can I, because my piano teacher that I had no interest in that. And she actually said, that's not really serious music. But I found when I was about 12, with many other young musicians who were studying with this guy, his name was Bernard Pfeiffer. He was a French guy that lived in Philadelphia. And he was a tough teacher. And once I started studying with him, you know, the first thing I said is, I don't want to play classical music. He said, you should keep on practicing it. First for the technique and second for the harmony. Do you know every chord in that Chopin prelude? If you don't, then if you can't hear it, you better study it. And all of a sudden I was thinking, oh, okay. And then I started to compose, and through Bernard Pfeiffer, I met another composer in Philadelphia named George Rochberg. I don't know if he's so well known here, but you know, he was a 12-tone composer who started writing tonal music and music that was like Mahler's style in the 70s. And he got a lot of criticism in the United States for that, because most of the academic composers that were teaching at Ivy League colleges, which he was teaching at, that was not, it was seen as a regression. But for me, I started studying with him when I was about 13 or 14. And he told me clearly, he said, when I go to the university, everybody thinks they're Igor Stravinsky. But if you want to study with me, I'm going to put you through this course where we're just going to go through different styles of music and different forms. We're going to study them, and then you write it. Can you do that? And I said, sure. So, we would Bach chorales, preludes in the well-tempered clavier, Chopin preludes, a mazurka, a song that was like Robert Schumann. And so every week I sort of had this thing of like, okay, what's going on in the music? Okay, let me see if I can sort of come up with something that's like that. And I found it to be very interesting to do that way. And at the same time with Pfeiffer, it was much more practice the piano, but also what does it mean to be an improvising musician? How do you get to the point of understanding what the traditions are, where you're playing with older people, playing with people your own age, listening to all types of different music. And all that was supplemented by, by the time I was 14 and 15, I was already playing around Philadelphia. And we had so many opportunities to play that when I look back on it, I thought it was normal. But a lot of the music that I'm doing now is because of those opportunities.
Your range of interest is amazing in a way. Like you started listening to Aretha Franklin and you wouldn't stop at Messiaen. And the word is eclectic, but why is it so hard for so many musicians, in a way, to look over the fence and to listen over the fence and to see and to find out what else is there?
I think a lot of that has to do with people's personalities, but my impression was that especially among the musicians that I was with, even if they were very prejudiced against a certain type of music, or they were very opinionated, that they had very strong opinions, to me that was good. I would always ask, like, well, what do you like about it? What is it? What is the real stuff that I should check out? And most musicians said, oh, if you're interested, you should listen to this and this. And I was more in that head. That I think it helped to be young, though, too, because, for instance, we had a record store in Philadelphia where we would go there every Saturday morning with the money that we made and buy records. And these guys were waiting for us. They said, man, you need to get Herbie Hancock. You need to buy this. And they were looking at us. And they also knew that we were, you're starting to play with this guy. We saw you're playing here. So even at a young age, it gave us an identity as, people that were in this sort of, like a cult or a guild or something, where there were older people that were teaching us, even if as we were getting older, we were thinking, that's just that guy's opinion. The important thing was to learn how to study, how to approach really absorbing something.
If you've been trained in so many styles and you have so many interests and so many varying perspectives, what's the fun part of working with material like Bach's Goldberg variations or Diabelli or Wagner? You've done this nice record doing Wagner in a cafe house style in Venice, which is so cute. And what's the fun of taking the originals apart and seeing how and whether it's possible to put them back together again, but differently? Or maybe I've explained what's the fun, but I don't know.
I think the fun is that especially if you're going through this type of process where you're trying to assimilate this music, but at the same time analyze it, and at the same time think to yourself, I see Mozart goes from A minor to this chord to this chord. What would happen if I went from that chord to that chord, not sounding like Mozart, just sort of playing these imagination games where you're trying to think, what could I do with different things? But I kept that in a way in reserve, because as I was getting older, I was dealing with that dichotomy. I was going to like an Ivy League university, studying with George Crumb in that type of world. And then I was playing music every night in clubs and in a way dreaming of going to New York And I didn't want to have an academic career, even though that was sort of the direction that a lot of the people in the school that I went to were going for, that, to become teachers in universities. I just think that I had a realization, I mean, this is before I even was in that through the piano, I could interact with all these worlds. And so if somebody said, oh, we need somebody to play like for dancers, piano. Behind singers, oh, piano. Big band needs a piano. A rehearsal pianist for somebody singing Schubert who just wanted to hire. All these things, and once you are aware that that skill can be transplanted into these different worlds, and then even more so realizing, wow, you know, in this type of music, you don't have to play so much that way. You have to play more like this way. Here you should be thinking about accompaniment. Here there's, you know, a chance for you to be very rhythmic, or all these things present themselves as opportunities. And then you just follow that and see what happens. And it doesn't always work out. I mean, you know, just to go back to the classical thing, for instance, you mentioned Goldberg variations or Diabelli variations. For jazz musicians, the theme and variations is the fundamental form of how we improvise. If somebody says, okay, here's a piece by George Gershwin that's 32 bars, 4 8-bar phrases, here's the harmony. Okay, we learn how to improvise over that harmony. Well, Bach is the same thing. His theme is 32 bars. First 8 bars, he's in the tonic. Second, he goes to the dominant. You're thinking, it's almost like a Harold Arlen song, in a way. Then you go into it. I mean, of course, I was listening to Glenn Gould and thinking, man, what is going on with all this music? And then starting to see, no, Bach is, every one of these variations is connected to a dance form, or it's connected to a virtuosity with two hands interlocking, or even a joke where there's two drinking songs where, you know, they're singing. The people would have appreciated the joke at the end of the Goldberg. It's like, oh, it's like a drinking party. It's a music party, and they're singing these songs that we know. As somebody who was used to playing over chord changes that way, that's one way to deal with that. But then even further, like to say, I mean, if he's writing sarabands, or he wants to write a piece that's sort of a tribute to Handel or to Scarlatti, not something that you would expect. Okay, what about a variation in the style of Monk using that harmony, or a mambo using that harmony? It is a very natural connection.
Did you never meet a musician, or was there no way that some sort of classical musician came up to you and told you, are you insane? Are you out of your mind? This is holy stuff. You just can't change the slightest piece.
That happened to me a lot.
What's your general answer then?
You know, my answer was, I wouldn't say that I expected it, but I understand it, because I myself can become very passionate, or very like, I like this, I don't like that, I think this is not right. So the idea of being judged by other people is something that I saw even when I was young. It's like it's not that you don't have to be aware of that, but you have to trust your own thing. And especially when you're with a group of musicians, it's okay to say, you know, even if people don't really like it, or it's not really communicating, we have to keep on working on it to see if we can work something out. And so it becomes almost this internal dialogue with other musicians that becomes much more important than presenting it to an audience.
And when you react like this to someone coming up to you and saying, are you insane, getting your hands on this sacred stuff, do they change their opinion afterwards and say, okay, I understand what you're doing, or is it just in vain?
Sometimes, okay. But you know, I find it to be on both sides, that people think of it as being much more complicated and amazing than it really is. To me, it's more just like it's not that amazing. It's just another version of that. And maybe within even music history, the idea of the paraphrase, or the idea of musicians arranging music for other mediums. When Liszt arranged Beethoven, it was because people couldn't go to a symphony orchestra and just hear his symphonies the way they can today, or turn on the radio or whatever. So that music had to be sort of rearranged and rethought of in order for it to become part of people's daily life. So in the sense that, I mean, actually that's a different idea than I think what you're asking about, which is that if your fundamental idea is that the music is so holy that you can't touch it and you can't transform it. I think in the improviser's culture that we're not as worried about that because we're used to taking these forms that already exist and saying, how can we open this up or how can we change it? So it's true, if somebody said, I'm going to take Mahler and do that, people are like, well, really? I mean, But my idea was also just the idea that since I had been, in a way, one of the first assignments I got with George Rochberg was he gave me the Fifth Symphony. He said, reduce it for piano. Oh. And it was to teach transposition and to start looking. And it took me so long in the beginning. It would take me hours just to do a couple bars. But then as I did it, and he told me this, he said, just keep on doing it and really think about it. Think about it. Think about what Mahler is doing, page by page, measure by measure. The subtleties of having 3 horns, not 4 horns, 2 horns, like he's doing all these things. For a young person to look at it and go, oh, okay, I see. And then once it becomes more normal, so you can actually play it and think, oh, okay, I think I understand what it is. It's a powerful feeling. I didn't think of that to think, oh, I'm going to take these pieces one day and make my own version.
Since you're mentioning Mahler, I've read that there was some sort of upheaval or stress resulting from you arranging Mahler's Urlicht, I think was the record. And Mahler, the German Mahler Society was sort of not happy about what you've done to this work.
No, I think more what happened, I wasn't there when this happened, but it won the Composer's Hut Award for the best Mahler CD, or I don't know, they have all these categories, and a lot of the more traditional people said, I mean, why are we giving, it's not really Mahler. And so that becomes the question, is it really Mahler, is it sort of a reflection on Mahler? But my perspective on that was a lot different than the Goldberg variations or the Diabelli variations, because in there, as I said before, you're taking this form that's very familiar to jazz musicians, of using the harmony as a basis for writing new pieces. The Mahler was more an impression, and I mean, I started to have this when I was a young person going to the Philadelphia Orchestra. And I remember I went with my grandmother once to this Mahler's, the symphony where, I think in the first symphony, it sort of sounds like klezmer music.
Yeah, the slow movement. Yeah.
She said, that sounds like klezmer music, and, we're Jewish people, and it was like, oh, Mahler was Jewish. I started to hear about the story, and she laughed and said, but, when you hear the way they play it, it doesn't really sound like the klezmer music that she was thinking of, which is much more wild. But it made an impression on me, oh, so he's taking these different musical associations and putting it in, and then starting to read about his life where people said, it's so vulgar that he does that. It's so banal that a serious composer in the middle would put this little, piece of dance music in it. What is that? But I understood it immediately as sort of, no, he's moving through all these different states. And it can go from ecstasy to the banality of a dance. And he said that himself, that when his parents were arguing a lot, he grew up in a very sort of tense household. And he would go outside and hear the hurdy-gurdy man playing it, and he associated that type of banality with... And again, it's a very personal thing, but as soon as I hear something like that, I'm like, okay.
By the way, he worked down the street. You know that?
Yeah.
At the Opera House.
I know.
There's a church over there where he was baptized.
I know.
Before going to Vienna, because he thought it'd be better if I'm not Jewish starting at the State Opera.
Yeah. I mean, all that consciousness of that came later because, I guess it was just a combination of having that music. At one point when Stephan Winter had a sort of a retrospective of his performers at a place called the Knitting Factory in New York, which was a club. And they showed a movie, and he had heard one of the records I did where I quoted the bass line from the Second Symphony. And he said, we made this movie about Mahler. I mean, why don't you see if you can put something together to accompany it? And after doing that and trying to get, even stuff that I had worked on when I was much younger together, he said, wow, we should record this. I said, no, let me work on it more, just to try to get that panorama of all these different styles of his music. And once that CD came out, I mean, I have to say, it sort of changed the perception that people had. And rather than being thought of as just a jazz musician, which, maybe in that world they don't get that much respect, people said, oh, he knows about Mahler, we should. And to me, it always seemed a little strange that really, you don't think that a lot of the musicians that are playing and studying don't know how to do that? They do know how to do that, but it was the opportunity, and also because I understood, we played that Mahler program in Salzburg, and there was protests.
Really?
And there were people that came to us and said, we're really happy that you came, you represent this, and the musicians, many of whom, they knew about Mahler, but not about all these things going around. They were like, what is he talking about? And, it just seemed like there was this disconnect of people taking things very seriously and thinking that you were doing something, and a more naturalistic approach where, it's just like anything. You take a group of songs or material from a composer, and by playing it and experimenting, you see where it goes.
Is it still happening, and is it still painful that you are seen as being not only a jazz musician, but as someone who can also play serious music, like jazz isn't serious in a way that classical music is, and
I would really have to say at this point in my life, and especially, after these last couple years of what, I'm really much more into the thing of, you follow your instinct and your heart, and I'm not saying that in a way just to be, no, I mean, there's a certain path that you can take that you have to work on it. You have to make sure that you're doing the best that you can, and then also allowing, especially if you want to have a group that's playing, to allow to build a structure that people feel that they can contribute to. And that was one thing that I learned in playing the classical music projects. It was different than jazz, because jazz has its own rules too. Even if you say, okay, we're playing straight ahead jazz and we're going to play over these harmonies that keep on going over and over, or we're going to play free music where, we don't play anything tonal. There's sort of this implied thing. All those things imply a certain awareness of how do you phrase, how do you reach a climax, how do you build something that can present a structure over a certain period of time. And a lot of the classical music pieces that we used as a basis flowed very easily that way. In other words, there's, you can play the Adagietto and then just play the music as it is, reorchestrate it or whatever, but then if a DJ is bringing in all this other Mahler against it, all of a sudden, even for the people that are just playing the normal music, it puts it in a different context. And it can either be very beautiful or very haunting or very oh no, that's the wrong thing to do. But I like that because so then how do you react to that when that happens? And sometimes it doesn't work. Sometimes you say, that thing, let's try something else tonight and do it. That's what I like about playing music together with other people.
By the way, a practical question. I've been talking a lot with classical pianists and technicians about picking the ideal instrument for the ideal occasion and just being very special about which instrument am I supposed to take. What is it with you? Are you as picky as a regular classical musician, or is it okay as long as there are 88 keys and sort of working?
I mean, I would say I'm more the second out of just necessity. Because, for instance, on a tour like this, it's very funny to hear the bass player complain, because in the old days, he could bring his own bass and he was comfortable. Now he has to play a different bass every night, and sometimes it's good. I said, man, I've been used to that all the time. You can't, obviously if you show up at a place and, the piano's not working, you say, come on. But no, I don't like to get that picky on that, because to me that's more an expression of anxiety about something deeper. And I would rather deal with the deeper thing than get upset that, oh, the piano's not good. So that means tonight I'm not going to play well because I don't have the piano, and that's my excuse. No, it's better to say, even though it's a bad piano, I'm not going to take it personally. I'm not going to think that you insulted me and that Martha Agridge is going to get the best piano, but I don't go there. It's just like, okay, this is what it is. We're going to do our best. And it's a challenge. And then that way it becomes, in a perverse way, fun.
Do you think that you're really spoiled enough for not being to not be able to work with an orchestra and a conductor anymore? Would you still be able to react to commands from a conductor like a classical musician should and does, being told what to do, what not to do?
So that's an interesting question, because what I've observed in my own situation is that even when I've been playing with conductors who, let's say, have a very strong personality and bring their own egotism to the situation, if you're the one that wrote the piece, and even more importantly, you're the one that's sitting up there playing, so the orchestra sees, oh, he can play, all of a sudden it's different than if you're the composer. And the composer's sitting in the hallway, and a lot of times the musicians are like, oh, here we go again. We have to play this difficult music. It's only going to be played once. You'll be gone. We have the job. You're nothing. Once you get up there on the stage and it's your piece, you say, no, that's not right. And it's shocking to them, because it's like, you don't talk that way. But I've had that situation where the conductor was saying, and I said, well, excuse me, that's not right. And everybody's like, whoa, he spoke. Then, this happened to me in Germany, where people said, you don't speak, even in a recording. It's your recording. The Tonmeister says what it is, and they all listen, and you too, because you're playing. But I found it to be more provocative to be, oh, really? That's the way it is? Well, here I am. Now you deal. Are you going to tell me that I can't play my own piece? And so they don't... I won't mention names, but I've had these situations where these guys sort of take you in the back of the room saying, what are you doing? I'm saying, man, follow me. Follow me. All this is bullshit. And okay. For some situation, I'm not really like that, doing that. It's more the idea of, and this was new to me when I started playing with a lot of orchestras, because I have to say maybe the jazz world, quote unquote jazz world, is more informal. There's not a, that idea that the grand maestro comes in and he knows everything and everybody has to follow them. Personally, I don't really like that idea at all. I understand that, okay, if you're going to have 120 musicians in front of you, logistically, somebody has to be the leader. And even in a trio, somebody has to be the leader sometimes. But the idea that these guys are like amazingly above everyone else, I find it very depressing that people in an orchestra, like somebody that spent his whole life learning how to play the clarinet, is subservient to some, and I'm sure they feel it too. They're like, I could
sure they feel.
Conduct Beethoven's Sixth better than you. I know it by heart. In fact, we all know it by heart. We don't need a conductor. We don't need one. You're superfluous. The audience thinks they need it. They like your hair. And then there's the situations where, especially if things are tricky, and I've done pieces where, for instance, the orchestra has to improvise, or there's a trading. So, okay, the drummer here will play 4 bars and then answered by the percussion section, and you realize they can't they can't hear something that for us is like, oh yeah, it's polyrhythmic, it's syncopated. It's 5 against 4 against. Okay, but that's normal for us.
Just listen to a regular German symphony orchestra playing the mambo out of Bernstein's West Side Story, and you know that this is sort of parallel world.
It's Yeah, I mean, again, not to contradict myself, I know that that's a cliche, that people say, oh, Americans have better sense of rhythm because they grow up. I mean, that is true in a certain way. I'm not so sure it's true today among young Germans that go to clubs and listen to jazz too and listen to mambos. If they do, I don't know. But that is definitely something that characterizes, I think, that tension. That when you're playing with somebody, I mean, I once did, I couldn't understand the beat of this guy's. He would, give a downbeat, and they literally seemed to me to come in like 3 seconds later. Mm-hmm. And I asked one of the people, how are you following him? He said, we don't follow him. It's so cynical. Oh. And so I thought, really? And they said, no, we don't. We don't follow him, really. And they give all these speeches and do this, and we just tolerate it because we're in an orchestra. That's our culture that we understand. And part of me, I found it comforting because I saw, it's like in a lot of situations in life where in order to get along, okay, let him be the conductor and the egomaniac, but when it comes to the clarinet solo, I'm in charge. Mm-hmm. And I don't know how that works if you're working with somebody for years and they're like, you never played that solo right. Never, do they really get into that thing, or does it become a thing where, like in our world, okay, he plays it his way, and he's going to be there, and it's okay, Or do you say, no, you will? So, I don't know, I think it's good to be flexible, but there's a certain power in being an outsider of that world.
But I guess you drive regular orchestras and regular conductors insane, in a way, with saying, okay, we could do it this way, or we could do it another way.
I'll tell you what drives them most insane, which is funny to me, which is that they always say, like, if you're playing and improvising, and then the second time you play it, it's totally different. They're like, are you going to do the same thing? Well, no, I'm never going to do the same thing. And they're like, why not? That was great. Yeah. That's it. You have to accept that as a given. I'm not going to do the same thing. So that's one thing that they do. But as I said, I mean, this happened to me one time when I was playing with Richard Wagner, and he's a very flexible conductor, and he's very open. He's also young. Mm-hmm. And he kept on saying, see how he's playing in a rhythm? Follow him. And that was, the orchestra was like, follow him? We're supposed to follow you. You're the conductor. He kept on saying no. Especially when there's something like a call and response, or I'm paraphrasing what they played, then, I'm putting a little rhythmic thing. They're very self-conscious about doing that. So it becomes something where it's okay, do it. But I don't cross that line with them unless it becomes something where, and this has happened to me, like with certain American orchestras especially, where, somebody will come up and say, you should be ashamed of what you're doing. You should be ashamed. You have all this knowledge and this is what you do.
And then you're only playing jazz.
Well, we're playing, in those cases, we were playing arrangements of, something like the Diabelli variations, and at that point, it's more like, that's just life. You're not going to please everybody. And you have to, as a musician, and I think any artist has to do this at some point, decide how much you're going to let other people in if they're judging you. Because it's often good. If somebody gives you a good criticism, you think about it and it hurts you, but you think, no, in a way, they're right.
Did you ever try to perform an experiment with jazz musicians, taking them to a regular symphony concert, like putting a bass player in front of a Bruckner symphony and see what happens?
Where he's improvising or she's improvising?
No, somebody who has no idea what's going to wait for him. Somebody who's never been, maybe jazz musicians never been to a regular Mahler symphony, to a Wagner opera, to a Bruckner symphony, and they get there and get this amazing experience all of just out of the blue.
Absolutely.
And what did happen then? Did you try this, and what were the reactions?
Well, I would say it would be, on two answers. One is that within the group that I had, or the groups that I've had playing it, certain of the people, for instance, in the Mahler group, they knew Mahler. They knew.
Sure, yeah.
And other people didn't know who Mahler was. They didn't understand what it was. But when they heard and got used to what we were playing and, I guess, internalized that repertoire, they would say, wow, I never had, to them, it's like, I never had that experience. And that's when you have to allow for those things. Part of you could think, especially in a city like New York, you can go right down the street and hear Mahler if you really want to do that. You can go on YouTube and hear it. Well, and to the extent that certain musicians are very research-oriented, in other words, like they're in the group, they're like, I'm going to learn everything I can about this. And then other people, I see that they want to be much more impressionistic. It's almost like they don't want to know too much about Mahler. And we would talk about that, because really, what do you need to know in order to play? And that's a very complicated story. I think another thing that happens is that by the reaction of the audience, in other words, this is a paradox. You're playing a piece that the whole audience knows, and they understand what you're doing, but some of the musicians don't know. So when an audience in Salzburg hears, oh, they're taking the Adagietto, but now there's a solo, and now there's... Wow. And to the person who's not conscious of that, they're just like, okay, what's the big deal? And that's when you have to explain. And then the answer is always, oh, that's the same in our world. Like even a DJ, if you did that, you're not a good DJ. If you play this way, you're not a good jazz musician. If you do that, that's the way you hold your hands. So there's always going to be that thing of, you have to prove your skill, or somehow that there's an element of contest in a lot of music and testing. And so you have to be able to stand up to that, but also to be able to say, this is not that. This is not the Mahler Symphony. This is us taking Mahler and doing something to it.
Is there a secret longing inside of you, wishing to perform a Beethoven concerto like it's been written, with a regular orchestra, getting applause, getting off the stage, and just being like all the other classical pianists are, or is this done for you?
Well, no, I would say I've never done it. I told you, that experience I had where I was thinking, okay, I'm going to devote 4 months and really practice every day and memorize, and I didn't find it to be that satisfying. I think, honestly, it's because I don't really, I know so many wonderful pianists that already play that, and many of whom are living in obscurity in Europe, in New York, people that, should be famous people because they're such great musicians and such great pianists. I'm humble by that. I'm not trying, I guess on some level the fantasy is, I wish I could do that. But understanding that I can't do that, and also in a way being told by other pianists, we're just one of 700 people that can play the Beethoven Fourth Piano Concerto. If you could get up there and improvise, if we could do what you did, we would have concerts. But now we're just one of many. Keep on doing what you're doing. When somebody tells you that, I don't take that to mean, oh, okay, I don't need to study it. No, I try to practice every day. And I'm still, I still want to get better as a pianist. So I don't have a complex about that, but I really, in my mind, think there's so many other people that can do that better, that's not really what my skill is. And it's a relaxation now. I wrote a lot of music during the pandemic when I was in Italy. I haven't done this so much, but I sent these songs that I wrote to my mother's poetry, and the woman that I sent it to is a very good singer. She said, well, you should play piano. And I was like, no, I don't want it. I would rather just listen to it. I don't want to have to sit and struggle. I know it's hard. And she didn't understand that. She said, it's your music. And I said, I know, but I would rather let someone else who's really good at that do that.
And talking about the composing side, there's no Schubert song cycle inside of you hidden somewhere waiting to be left out in the blue?
No. I've written a lot of songs. A lot of the classical music that I've written has not been recorded or played, or it's like many composers. It's commissioned and played once or twice. There's a recording, but it's I wish I could record more of what I've written, and I realize that a lot of it is because it's expensive and there's not really a public for it, all those things. So, but no, I've tried to do a lot of different things, like write an opera or write a musical, and
you got stuck somewhere in the middle, or?
It was different things. I mean, the thing with writing a musical is that you need a lot of, unlike, let's say, the world that we're in, where we're very independent and 3 people could do something. That's not that world. You need to really be a fundraiser, and the organization of it is daunting. So for me, the way I work better, I think, is by being commissioned, let's say, by an orchestra. Okay, so at least there's a parameter that's set, but much better even than with chamber musicians.
But how hard was it when you were into an opera or into a musical and working in it, and then realizing, no, this is not going to happen, and just putting it back into a cupboard and saying goodbye? Right. Is that really something that's hard, or maybe isn't it as hard for you as for many regular composers, because you're in a more improvising state of mind anyway, and you might be thinking, okay, if this doesn't work out, something else will work out?
I mean, there is that, but I mean, usually the way that works is somebody approaches you and says, like, we're thinking of doing a musical about this guy's life or this situation, and here's the words, and see what you can come up with. And my experience with doing it, I mean, I'm not really in that world the way you have to be in that world. That's another thing that you see as a musician. All these specialties, all these little niches.
I was just wondering, how hard was it for you to say goodbye to this project? Was it just like, okay, we're done?
It was hard because the way it ended for me was very brutal. In other words, it didn't just end for me. This was much more of a thing where I wrote the music. We recorded the music. We got a lot of singers. It sounded good. They started doing this thing where they try to raise money.
And then somebody pulled the plug.
And somebody came in and said, you know what? This whole idea is, we're not going to give money to this. This needs to become more commercial. And so the guy that was sort of that I was working for, he was the one that got depressed, and he said, it's not going to be what we thought it was going to be. And they want to change this, and they want to do this, and they want to add a love story, and they, all the Broadway things that happen. I'm not really of that world, but I didn't feel like my ego was on the line, because they weren't criticizing me. They were criticizing the whole totality of the show. But what I did learn from that is, like, when we would have a meeting, like these meetings that they have, there would be like 30 people sitting at a table. This guy's the costume person. This guy's the script guy. He's the actor's coach for this. I mean, we don't have that in our world. We travel very light, and you know what I mean? So it was a learning experience.
So do you think we might be missing the next Hamilton from you?
Well, I don't know about Hamilton, but I definitely went through a Stephen Sondheim phase, and I'm thinking about him because he died. But I had a friend of mine who loved Stephen Sondheim. I didn't know Stephen Sondheim. And then we would get together and she would sing these songs, and it was so beautiful. We would start crying. It was so lovely. And so I was like, okay, this is something else. And then I started to think, I mean, in a certain way, if somebody gives me the words, I can do it.
Okay.
I don't feel, and then, I mean, I do something else, which is also confusing, which is I started to go to Broadway when I was working on this project, and I saw there's no Stephen Sondheim up here. It's all this like really loud rock music. The music is so loud. It's I hated the music. I mean, I went to a couple of shows where I felt like I was going deaf because it's just, and then somebody told me they like Stephen Sondheim because, okay, now he died, and you can see the arc of his life, but he never made any money on his plays. And I said, are you serious, really? I mean, to me, he's great. He said, it's not what Broadway is. Okay, so what do you do with that information? You say, okay, I'm going to keep on writing like Stephen Sondheim because I like that. Or somebody says, no, the producer doesn't like that. He wants you to write something more like Miss Saigon. Go see Miss Saigon and see if you can do it. That's when it becomes, there's a certain point, I think this is what you're asking, where I say, you know what, another thing, I don't need to be the one that does this. I like it, but it's a selfish feeling. Why? I like the feeling of getting up in the morning and having Stevens, that idea that you work in the morning and then in lunchtime you have a song. And then you can take it in the afternoon and fix it, and then you play it for somebody and you fix it again. And you're working on it and it develops, and there's something so beautiful about how that, and then you involve other people in it and then they're like, oh, it's good or bad or whatever. I am comfortable with that. I mean, I think it's the same thing with opera. There's a lot of people that ask, how can you stage an opera when you need $1 million every night just to put on an opera at the Met? It's incredible. But it's, I guess in my mind, I'm thinking on some level, it's probably not on the list of my priorities, but that doesn't mean I haven't studied a lot of operas to try to think if somebody said to you to do it. But, right, there's only so much time in the day. So at some point you say, should I be thinking about writing an opera that probably is going to need millions of dollars? Or can I just call up a string quartet and say, let's make a record this way? And I'd find that to be better.
I think I know one of your darkest secrets, if the archive wasn't lying, that you've played at an inaugural ball at Ronald Reagan's festive inauguration. Is that true?
That was true, because I used to play with a judge from Philadelphia who, my parents were very leftist. My father was very, like, the president of the American Civil Liberties Union.
Yeah, but what was that like, playing there and having Ronald Reagan dance around you when you're coming from...
I didn't see Ronald Reagan, but what happened is that the judge, there was a judge in Philadelphia he was a good man, and he was a Republican, and he was invited to play at the ball. So what the balls are all these drunk Republicans. And it wasn't Reagan, it was Reagan's daughter, Maureen. Okay. And she was so drunk that she was licking the Secret Service man's neck as she was dancing. We had to do a dance, and we were playing. I mean, I was like 17 or 18 years old. And we saw this woman licking this guy's, he had a Secret Service thing on. And even the judge said, well, it's pretty weird. So we went up to, it was absurd. Yeah. And it was, you see a general that you would say, that's a General Omar Bradley, from World War II. But by the end of that night, everybody was like, man, we're never going to do that again. Although to me it was funny. And she actually married that man.
Okay. And
she left her husband to marry the Secret Service aide that protected him. And we saw that first night of their romance.
But was the pay okay, at least, for you?
It probably was not okay, but I was so happy to be playing because I didn't work. I was one of those people that when somebody told me you could make money playing music, I was in high school, I was around that age, 14 and 15. I was shocked. I said, really? And that became one of my goals. And I felt financially independent. As soon as I left my parents' home, I was working every night. And I had an apartment in downtown Philadelphia, and I was a student. And I thought, man, this is the life.
And is it still the life?
No, I had to, at some point, the older people in Philadelphia said, you need to leave Philadelphia. You need to go to New York. You need, that was that generation. I don't know if young musicians feel that. But in our time, and especially because New York is like 90 miles away from Philadelphia. So we were already going up to New York to play and listen to music, but it seemed like such a different... Philadelphia was friendly. It was, especially if you could play, you were protected, and it was a beautiful feeling. And when I look back on it, I think, it was normal, but it wasn't. Once I moved to New York, it became a lot harder because, first of all, there's no money, even if you're playing a lot of these gigs. We weren't being paid properly in New York, and also there's so many great musicians. So my life just sort of changed. I went from being somebody that was, working all the time and playing with everybody to somebody that had to start again in a way. But it's typical. I mean, I don't think it's different for many other people.
What's the one piece you would have loved to compose?
Wow, many. But I don't know, something like The Rite of Spring. I think about music that when I first heard it was so amazing that I had to really study it and still study it. So I was really into Stravinsky, into Varese, into Berg. Speaking about operas, I studied a lot of Wozzeck. But those types of pieces, because when I was younger and I was really into the whole mythology of what modern music was, and I was, that was the thing that was so weird when I was telling you about Rochberg, because I already knew Rochberg was writing 12-tone music, and I had been to some of the concerts, and he said, we're not doing any of that.
I am sorry if I'm really bringing up a big, giant cliche maybe, but you being Jewish, did anybody come up to you when you did this Wagner project saying,
Yes.
are you out of your mind?
Yes.
And what was your reaction to that?
I mean, my reaction was, again, it's like, I know Wagner was an anti-Semite, but I didn't meet Wagner that way. I met Wagner when my piano teacher, when Pfeiffer said, get a score of Tristan and Isolde and tell me what the chords are in the prelude. And and it was written in 1853 or whatever. Tell me what the chords are. And it has a lot of jazz chords in it, at least if you use that terminology. It has a flat 7, a dominant 7, flat 5. Whoa, in 1853?
The Tristan chord.
Right, and he was just saying, well, check it out. And so that was before I knew the history of Wagner. Then, of course, I started to read it. And, I came from a very, it wasn't a typical Jewish family in the sense that my parents were 18, like when World War II was over. So that was traumatic after the Holocaust. How do we continue Jewish life? And many younger people at that time said the answer is to reject Europe and Yiddish culture, the culture that had been in Europe, and to try to reinvent Hebrew culture, which was Israel and speaking Hebrew. So my parents only spoke Hebrew to us, and we learned a very Shakespearean Hebrew. And we would go to Israel when we were little kids, my brothers.
Shakespearean Hebrew? So there's a sort of old-fashioned, ancient sort of...
Because Hebrew is the Bible, which is a very... It's very powerful, especially because it's very short and very intense. It's very beautiful Hebrew. But when they tried to revive the Jewish language, this is like around 1880, 1890, when people were thinking about leaving Europe and maybe having a Jewish homeland in Israel, Hebrew became, the question was, what language will we speak in this new land? And Herzl, who was the main Zionist, said, of course, it has to be German. German's the best language.
But you didn't get into any trouble getting your hands on Wagner's music?
No, I had people who were, let's say, for instance, Wagner was banned in Israel. You could not play Wagner. And when Daniel Barenboim tried to do it, what happened was that all the survivors came and they showed their arms with the numbers, and they just stood in front of the podium. And the Israel Philharmonic said, we can't do this. It's too emotional. So we banned Wagner. And then Barenboim said, that's ridiculous. Wagner is part of music history. You can always say anti-Semitism is bad, he was an anti-Semite, the society, whatever, but as a musician. And I agree with that. It's not that I'm not conscious of Jewish history. I'm very conscious of it. And it's not also that I've heard people defend Wagner. He said, no, he had Herman Levy. Herman Levy was a Jewish conductor. He committed suicide because he was Jewish. But I understand that there's all these, especially today with what's going on with identity politics and Black Lives Matter, all these things are very painful because the society is trying to do what's right, but in doing what's right, it digs up a lot of things that are uncomfortable for people. They don't want to hear about their grandparents were Nazis. You don't want to hear that your grandfather was a slave owner. That's what he did. And you're like, well, no, that doesn't make me a bad person. I'm just, okay. It doesn't make you a bad person. It just means that you have the choice to either confront that history and say, this is what happened and we don't want it to happen again. Okay, so you can say to Wagner, there's no reason to be anti-Semitic, but having said that, and it sounds very naive, okay, let's see what he said about the Jewish people. And what he's saying actually is a very strange thing when you read Wagner about the Jews. Wagner is saying the Jews will never be a people with originality. All they can do is steal from other people. And all they can do is popularize. It's still a stereotype that I think exists. Oh yeah, the Jews are good at Broadway, but if you really want a serious composer, or Leonard Bernstein, he was sort of a pop, he's not a real composer. Okay, I mean, we can argue about that and whether that's anti-Semitic or has anything to do with it. As somebody that's very aware of that, and I'm sure this is in every group, you can't just say the Jews, the Germans. There's so much strife between that. If you go to Israel and see how people argue, I could argue that there's certain people in Israel who were Israelis are more anti-Semitic than anybody I've ever heard when they start talking about religious people. You're like, whoa. So I'm not, you understand what I'm trying to say here? I'm proud of being Jewish because I was raised in that, but I'm not sure what it means any more than basically saying something like, I love my mother. I love the food that I grew up with. I love the music that I heard when I was 5 because when I went to the synagogue every person that has impressions of how they grew up and how that connects their life to as they're going on, there's an element of nostalgia and an element of fantasy in it and an element of bullshit in it too.
One of the most amazing projects I can think of is, I don't know whether you know this record, Mandy Patinkin. He's done
I know him.
This record, Mama Loschen.
Mama Loschen, exactly.
Which is amazing.
Right.
I mean, and it's completely unknown over here. And that's a fascinating facet of this part of history.
I made a record with him, with Don Byron, where he was, again, it was sort of interesting because he has his version of what he thinks Judaism is, but some of the people that were dealing with it were saying behind his back he doesn't know anything about it. He's really sort of an assimilated Jew. I'm not saying that, but you know what I mean? That you're never going to get an agreement between all these people that supposedly like the same things about what all these things mean. And it starts to become a thing for me, like, is this a distraction, really, from what's important? Or is it something that's important to say from the beginning, this is where it's at, and then we just leave it alone?
So maybe jazz musicians are better at discussing this because they are used to work with basic structures and then find out wherever they're going and see what happens. That's
certainly a skill that they're encouraged to. That flexibility of mind is part of the musical culture.
Okay.
And not in everyone, because again, there's jazz where they're saying, this is jazz. You guys aren't playing jazz. Like what we're going to play tonight, that's not jazz. It's sort of jazz, but it's not really. And then other people say, no, it is. So you're never going to get an agreement on that.
Let's end with an easy question, maybe, or maybe not. If you'd had the chance of being reborn, what would it rather be? Art Tatum or Vladimir Horowitz?
I mean, I guess I would say Art Tatum, except for the blindness. But but I like Horowitz because I like Horowitz's sense of humor. He's a strange man, and on some level, he's very amazing too. But no, I like and that's a weird juxtaposition because of all the jazz pianists, criticism of Art Tatum, if you can criticize somebody who has so much technique, is that's what he was. He was a technician. He used formulas that if you listen to him over and over again, I don't agree with this, but he's a different type of pianist. He sort of has his cliches and his formulas. But, so in that sense, maybe he's not as original as somebody else. But the thing that always struck me is that when you read about the contemporaries, people like Bud Powell and other people, that when Art Tatum would walk in, they would say, God is in the house.
I don't want to play.
I can't play in front of this guy. And I mean, to think of those guys at that level saying, please, Mr. Tatum, you got it. And that respect. And, I have to say that I saw that a lot growing up. That humility to say, we give it up to you. And I think that that's not all, jazz musicians are so generous to each other, but there's sort of a camaraderie and the support. The people, this is one thing that really struck me when I first moved to New York. I used to go to this place called Bradley's where all the piano players played. And I saw Cecil Taylor listening to Tommy Flanagan, so somebody who's totally playing, atonal, sitting and talking to somebody who's playing very genteel. And loving him and telling him, man, you sound great. And I thought, right, that's the way it should be. That it doesn't have to be this ego show all the time.
So which one would it be then, finally?
I would say Art Tatum. Okay. Because, I'm coming from that.
Good choice.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. We're done.
Thank you.
And it's been fun, and I hope you'll enjoy your concert, and I'm looking forward to seeing you on other stages here as well, and enjoy your stay here in Hamburg.
I love Hamburg.
Weitere Podcasts vom Hamburger Abendblatt finden Sie auf abendblatt.de/podcast.